So, welcome back to our conference, and really, once again, thanks so much to Zafar, Basileus, and Ramya for the absolutely fascinating discussion we had on identity politics, on the sectarianization of the whole conflict in Syria. Our panel now is titled Confronting War and Colonialism, Solidarity Economy in Syria and Palestine. And I think that is another fascinating discussion we will have with Rabia Nasser, Tarek Sadek, and Omar Dahi. And it's my absolute pleasure to introduce to you Sami Al-Botme, who will chair this panel. Samia, great to see you again. Thanks really so much for chairing this panel. Samia is an assistant professor in economics at the Faculty of Business and Economics at Birzeit University. And Samia served as the director of the Center for Development Studies, I think from 2011 until 2014, something like that. Yes. Thanks really so much for chairing now, and over to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Helmut. I'll switch now into Arabic because this session is supposed to be run in Arabic. برحب الجميع في الجلسة قبل الأخيرة في
I would like to welcome you all before the last session of this conference on solidarities and conflict and war zones. The title of our session now is Confronting War and Colonialism, Solidarity Economy in Syria and Palestine. Before starting this panel and before introducing you to our panelists, I would like to remind you that we have interpretation for those who need interpretation. I need to tell you that this session will be in Arabic. For those who need to listen to the English language, the interpretation into English is available. In this session, just like in the other sessions, we will have 15 minutes for each of the panelists. And then after the panelists' interventions, we will have some time for questions and answers, of course. I would like to start with introducing you to our speakers, our panelists. Our first panelist is Mr. Rabia Nasser. Mr. Nasser is an economic researcher in Vienna and the Department of Development Studies and at the Syrian Center for Policy Research, and he works on macroeconomics, poverty, the different economic impacts of conflict as well. I would like to welcome you with us, Mr. Nasser. Our second panelist is Mr. Tarek Sadek from Palestine. He is an assistant professor in the Department of Economics in Birzeit University. He's my colleague. He was the director of the Masters of Applied Statistics in Birzeit, and he's also working in Ramallah on economics. He focuses on the economy of work, on poverty and injustices. We also have with us Mr. Omar Dahi, who is an associate professor in Hampshire College at the USA. And he's also at Massachusetts University. He focuses in his researches on development, world trade, and the South-South relationships and political economy in the Middle East. I would like to open the session with Mr. Rabia, then afterwards Tarek, and afterwards Omar. Thank you very much, Ms. Al-Botmi, for this introduction. But can Omar start first, because he will be speaking about the violence economies, and then I'll be speaking about solidarity economy, if there is no problem. Omar, if you don't mind, can you please start? Hello, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Botmi, for this introduction, I would like to thank all the organizers of this conference. I would like also to thank all the audience that's with us today. I'm very happy to be with you. My intervention will actually complement the interventions of my colleagues yesterday and today. And I think also that Rabia's intervention will be connected to my presentation, and the same goes for Tariq's. Allow me now to share my screen so that you can all follow the PowerPoint. Is it clear? Can you all see it? Yes. Thank you. Thank you. So, confronting conflict economies in Syria and Levant. Allow me to start with an overview of this presentation, a brief overview. This intervention is based on a research paper that we developed with the Syrian Center for Policy Research and different dialogue sessions that were supervised by the center. This followed a methodology that was based on background documents, on researches related to literature, and was based also on sessions and meetings with experts in the Syrian affairs, and their expertise really enriched our knowledge, our conceptualization of this approach. So what I will present today is only part of this paper. I will not be able to tackle all the ideas in the paper, and I hope that you will read it later on. I will also tackle other issues that are not related to the paper itself, but related to other research paper that we developed. I will present the most important findings of these research papers. Also, how can we think about the conflict economies in a comprehensive way? What is also the analytical framework of this conflict economy, and how is it different than the other frameworks or approaches? The approach that we adopted includes the three dimensions, or the way we define conflict economy includes three dimensions. One, we have monitoring the economic distortions and non-economic distortions also under the conflict in order to understand the results and also the causes of such distortions, because we're able to monitor a number of distortions in the conflict in Syria. What are their causes, the reasons behind them, and how can we monitor the actors who caused these distortions? What are their policies? And we try to broaden the framework in order to try and find different actors that intervened in different ways. Second, the instrumentalization or politicization of economy for pursuit of conflict, for militarization, and for pursuit of war. So how they used the economy for the pursuit of war. And the third dimension of our definition is about the precedents and antecedents for conflict economies, or also for violent conflicts. So the violent conflict didn't come from void in Syria. It emerged in Syria and the Middle East region. That is one of the regions where we have the very strong militarization. We have had different occupations. We still have colonial occupation of Palestine. We still have external invasions like what happened in Iraq. So we need to understand this framework before starting trying to understand the conflict in Syria. So there was a conducive environment that led to this conflict in Syria. This framework doesn't have only a security and a military dimension, but also an economic one, and this is what created more vulnerability, more injustices, more inequalities. Of course, conflict economies do not end when the armed conflict ends. So how can we altogether think about that so that we can try and dismantle the violence economies? How can we think about alternatives? How can we think of policies that can help us dismantle these conflict economies? Now, of course, this is something very complex. And we're trying in this paper to put forward the framework and some ideas so that later on there can be more studies and more writings about this. What are the ideas that I would like to lay down today? As I said, we need a comprehensive framework to understand the conflict economies and exit them. And this requires analyzing interconnections between military, security, economic, social, and political policies before and during the Syrian conflict at the local, national, and international levels, because Syria is not a silo, it's not an island. What happened in Syria did not happen in a void, but within an international order, and we need to understand its role and its impact on Syria, and we need to understand the impact of the war in Syria on the international order. So this is what we mean by the comprehensive framework. The second idea is that the conflict in Syria has different dimensions, because this is an inter-state conflict, and it's also a conflict between different states. So marginalizing one of these dimensions leads to not understanding completely the conflict in Syria and how it continued all this time. And marginalizing or not understanding the conflict and its multiple dimensions, not just at the analytical level, but also at the level of the literature, will lead to not understanding this conflict as a whole. So the conflict in Syria is quite complex, and we need to pay attention to all of these dimensions. Third, this can be contested, but this is something I'm convinced of. There needs to be an alternative political, social, economic program that could draw a critical mass of Arab populations in the Middle East. And the absence of such alternative was a key problem in the uprisings and one of the main things that led to their failure. So in my opinion, not trying to build a vision for a system or for alternative socio-economic policies was one of the failure causes. And going towards authoritarianism in Tunisia was because democracy didn't lead to a quantum leap at the social political level. So not a lot of people were convinced that democracy was not void of content, maybe. But to be fair, this failure didn't happen only because the social movements failed. It's also because there is a void here at the world level of such alternatives. Before, when we had the development era, there were some development models where the private sector played a role, where the state played a role. And this presented a development vision, and they were able somehow to come up with the development in the South. But then there were more inequalities, there were more injustices after this development era ended. And after neoliberalism, and many people maybe still don't believe that it ended, but after the financial crises in Europe and in the United States, we are searching for another alternative. What is this alternative? We can discuss this. The main idea is not just peace per se, but it's this shift from a system or from a region that was unjust, that was known for inequalities. So a shift to a region where there is an attempt to create new concepts or alternative concepts and policies where we can really increase the reign of justice. So this framework of analysis should lead us to a specific result. Now, I will not go into this now, but I would like to just tackle an idea. The regional situation before the uprisings in the Arab region was accompanied by a number of policies that led to more inequalities and to more injustice. So towards the end of the 90s, there was an economic stagnation or even regression in the region. This is due to many causes. I will not go into the details, but the reaction of the systems here at the beginning of the 2000s was facing an important time. They could have chosen development. They could have chosen the option that would promote the development economy based on productivity, and they could have built a new economic pact where there is more openness, where they could give more margins to the independent parties. But the countries of the region in general did not choose this option. At the economic level, they increased their use of neoliberal policies at a certain level, and they increased also the level of securitization, and they created civil society, they oppressed civil society and the independent parties. So here it's very important to think about this, not just to write history, but so that we won't repeat the failed policies in the region. That's why I say that it was an important, this was an important crossroad. And as you can see here, there was a regression and the growth rate in the GDP in the 90s. This increased so at the beginning of the 2000s, there wasn't a regression, there was an increase in the growth rates, and international institutions praised that, but this didn't lead to development. So there was growth, but there was no development, or there was no equal development. And this was based on foreign investments that increased in a huge way after the 90s, because the solutions for the countries were to open their doors for the foreign investments, but these foreign investments were not productive and were not conducive to employment. So now we reached a region with high securitization level, with high militarization level. There is like a new Cold War, like it's said, between the Gulf countries and the resistance countries. And we see China and Russia as great powers that are trying to have a world role at the military level in Russia and the economic level in China. So the analytical framework tries to understand the conflict economies based on all of that. And the local dynamics constitute a circle within other circles that instigate the conflict and affect the regional level and the international level as well. Meaning that the international order that is militarized and where we see inequalities affected the environment before the conflict and during the conflict through the weapons and through instigating the conflicts at the local and regional level through the financial aids that were sometimes beneficial, were sometimes distorting through some economic sanctions that harnessed the role of warlords. This, of course, badly affected the infrastructure and led to more destruction. And we have already heard about identity politicization. So the paper tried to monitor the actors, the causes, and the outcomes. For example, the actors here are USA, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, Hezbollah, Iran, Russia, their role in militarization and how this created a certain environment of conflict economy. So there was like proxy war in Syria, people immigrated, people were forcibly displaced, this violated the Syrian sovereignty. Syria became more dependent at the economic level and political level, so more dependent of other countries. So we look into the actors, we see what their policies and actions are and how these policies and actions contributed to creating specific conflict economies. Now, of course, I will not be able to go into the details, but we tried in this paper to see what's happening at the international level. Then we moved to the national level through detailing the policies of the Syrian government, and those followed by what's called the international coalition and the armed non-state actors and how this created also some conflict economies. I think that beyond the time that was allocated to me, do I still have 2 minutes? Yes, 2 minutes. For example, here the actor is the Syrian government. What about their policies and the action? We can see how they have high military spending and high incentives for soldiers, how they didn't spend enough on development, destruction of infrastructure, forced displacement, relying on warlords, and rely on people who would continue the war and the conflict, and how this created crony capitalism and this led to the accumulation of the illegal accumulation of the capital with all this informality. So the idea is that we are trying to look into this framework and understand it at the local level. Of course, we didn't disregard the role of the civil society. Now, how can we exit this conflict economy? The more we widen the circle of analysis, the more things are complicated, and the more it's difficult for us to try to touch on the different dynamics in one simplified framework, but it is something essential that you should do, because if the landscape is complicated, it doesn't mean that we need to simplify it. We need to understand the different complexities and see how there could be solutions linking between the different axes so that we can exit this conflict economy. Is this the social axis, the political axis, the economic axis? Now, there is maybe a focus on political solutions and on the political axis. And of course, there is a number of demands because there is a lot of grievances and sooner or later there needs to be a confrontation of that in Syria. But during that, what is the role of the civil society as people who are not in the power? What can we do as people who are not leaders of militaries? What are the principles of a productive economy? How can we move from conflict economy to productive economy? And here we have 3 levels. There is the international level. And I think that civil society should demand to reject the normalization of war, because what's happening in the region now is that they're trying to normalize war, to normalize occupation and securitization. So violating international norms and resolutions has become something normal. So any state can launch a war. This is something that was started by many countries, and other countries are following suit. So we see how what great powers are doing on the lands of the South, and we reject that. At the international level, we need to exit the institutions that are being that are excluding others, and we should focus on inequalities and address horizontal and regional inequalities, and the same goes for the legal level. And I think I was able, or I hope I was able to give you an idea about what we're trying to do to understand the conflict economies. Of course, this is the start, and this needs, of course, to be reviewed and developed. So we see how there can be points of entry, points of solutions in the future. This is the bibliography, some of it that I used.
بس بحب أذكر إنه إذا في عندكم أي أسئلة.
Thank you, Amar. Thank you for this highly important presentation. I would like to remind you that if you have any questions, you may already ask them through the chat so that we can discuss them later. Rabia, you have the floor. Thank you very much. I am very happy to be with you, and thank you, Amar and Tariq and Ali as well. I will try first of all to talk about the KnowWar project, as we have tried to compare various phases. Allow me to share my screen with you. We have tried to take various phases of analysis. There was a cumulative analysis, as Amar talked about the concepts, where we were allowed to diagnose the situation that is quite complicated and complex with Syria, and we move from there to the role of the private sector in the war economies, the role of the civil society in the war economies. And this for us was a very important and very rich discussion that expresses how we explain and analyze the situation without limiting ourselves to only drug dealers and warlords who are making the latest violations. And this way we would have missed the main issues. We saw that we have a great diversion of funds toward the economies of war. There are billions of dollars that were moved that way, and these are the ones that are setting the foundation for war economies. What is paid for brokers or small scale brokers is only at the lowest level of the scale. We also were analyzing the main actors, the current ones, as Omar said, and the potential actors in the future in experiences and their work towards development. what can be their roles in the future. We went into details about the economy of conflict, how it is, if there is a potential political solution or not, how things will look like, and that widest context that takes into consideration the social and economic context as well, so that we understand how it can transform. We also continued with the alternative economy context. One of the issues that Omar mentioned was that even the advanced ideas about economy or the social economy for the future of the region is a framework that is not acceptable, that does not ensure justice, that does not ensure sustainability, that does not ensure inclusion of all social factions. And I will say why in my intervention. This is an expression of a small part where I will be trying to link the war economies and why at this stage we should start thinking about transformation. Who should do the transformation, all the way to the importance of a new framework for work. I will talk about a very important issue in the last 2 years as the military actions have decreased and how things have changed in that sense. I will also talk about the concept of the social agreements, how we can build for the future without the Security Council, without closed rooms, how we can start building. And this is what is meant by the idea of localization. It is the idea of building a local community that surpasses the local groups, and how that can be an entry point to build for the future. I will quickly talk about the social and solidarity economy. That is not a social solidarity economy of the markets. It is an alternative to it. I will say how in detail. And we have a suggestion that we have developed through the discussion and with an economic work from the civil society through various discussions as a starting point, and some alternative policies as well. The main issue about the economies of violence is that we have had a change in institutions. That means that we have a system that is based on conflict as its foundation. Thus, the core job of the public sector has changed. If it was for the Ministry of Defense, if the task was to defend the country, now it became gathering means to fight in the country. So there is a description or a job description change that we cannot let go of or surpass. This requires a great investment in culture, in standards, in the way institutions have been shifted to turn things back. It requires a great investment, but what is harder is that, for instance, the Ministry of Power that gives power to some regions and deprives other parts of the country. This is a culture that has mutilated the institutions and their values, and it requires a lot of work that is completely far away from political solutions, as important as they may be. The idea of dependency on help, on countries that are funding and supporting on external solutions, the generalization of the idea that we are not able of creating our own solutions is a very dangerous point and very dangerous issue. The greatest work of redistribution of wealth in Syria happened during the war because the destruction or the reassignment of or allocation has existed, also looting. So the transfer of wealth was made easier, and this creates great challenges for us to be able to let go and to get past this phase. What I would like to say is that the change in value in culture and institutions is at the core of the conflict economies, and this will stay with us more than other points. The idea I would like to talk about the economic losses. I would like to say that the losses are great. I tried to minimize the idea and minimize the numbers or the required funds for reconstruction. We expect and we estimate it will be more than $650 billion. Reconstruction is bringing a lot of funds. It is about the rehabilitation of institutions, the change of the institutions. It is about an operation that requires hundreds of thousands of people's efforts and great investment. What I would like to say is that despite the decrease in military action, there were new economic collapses. In the last year, we've had a 19% recession in the growth. After all the collapse, we are talking about less than a third of the Syrian economy of what is left in 2010. What is left is mostly based on the expenditure of help and donations. This is not due to a drought, as many might think that this is the cause of the decrease or the regression of sectors in the regions, whether the regions of the regime or the opposition areas. What we need is to regain trust and rehabilitate the work in order to try and correct the results and the impact of the conflict. I will give a slight example about the idea of collapses that were subsequent. There was a resistance of a great collapse during the conflict, especially that the conflict economy tries to distribute funds, but still in the last 2 years, despite the decrease in military action, but there was a collapse of the currency and great rates of inflation. We are talking about huge numbers for inflation, as we have seen a new level of collapse where it has reached a level of loss of hope, where most populations have seen that the performance of the controlling groups is not only to oppress the armed opposition, but also the society, which leads us to a collapse, to a loss of hope that there will be any change, be it on the level of institutions or economy. Of course, going deeper in the levels of poverty is linked to the idea that the regime is pretending to protect or to save the system, or that it is waiting for the end of the military action to ensure development. This was made clearer to people that the conflict parties were working for a destruction for the future and not for a temporary phase. The expenditure is still mostly military, as you can see. The main local forces count on hugely on external support. Some of the assistance comes directly as weapons, others as salaries and paychecks. What we are talking about, and the main idea of when we are talking about, is to reinstate the role of the society in the economic action and the political action. The idea that is linked to the apolitical role of the civil society cannot be a solution for Syria. It cannot be a solution to the economies of conflict without an economy that is an ally of the system is weak. It does not have the capacity to make any change. What we are suggesting is, first of all, an economy for the society to reinstall the priorities, even if we're talking about a long-term system, and to build the institutions through the discussions and through the society. So the idea of agreement on the political level will not lead to a sustainable change on the level of institutions. These will be over, despite the fact that all the political issues, and be it regional or local, it will not be in favor of the society. Regardless of that, the social points build for the future. It is what builds the economy that is free from the impact of the conflict. These congruences, I will talk very quickly about an example. The priority of the local forces here and the priorities of the civil society. We see here that the points that are the closer to the civil society and to the priorities of the civil society, according to the research that we have conducted, is linked to well-being, and maybe that can be an entry point, an easier entry point. I'm not saying that it's going to be an easy one, but it might be easier for the society. And here I'm talking mostly about the social interest in a way that takes into consideration all the factors. Here we are talking about development that includes a political action, and I will say what I mean shortly. Because if we agree on the idea of, or the cause of freedom or justice, the conflict will become much bigger, and maybe that entry point would be very difficult, but there could be others as well. Also for the external forces, here again, the evolution could be part of this, because what we have done shows that the food sovereignty could be a starting point for change, as it is linked to governance and to justice, but the entry point can be better. Social and solidarity economy. Allow me to talk a little bit about 4 misconceptions quickly. The first misconception is that if we talk about an economic alternative or liberal policies that have led to a gap in the society, or even in the level of economic well-being itself. If you take, for example, North Korea, so if we want to explain what we are talking about as an alternative economy, we are talking about an economy, a market economy that is a radical alternative. It is an alternative on how to build the economy, also an alternative for the dictators and for the authoritarian countries. This is to clarify so that there are no misconceptions. The other point is that economic freedom is the core of the political freedom. This is something that I will mention quickly. Economic freedom does not mean freedom, because it is based on the wealth at the expense of persons, of workers, of regular people. Wealth to start with, and we can give examples of how all the political and social discrimination is based on that at the expense of the rest of the society. So a system based on exclusion is, and talking about that is a fallacy. Suddenly, we see that there is a welcoming of that freedom for most countries that are the most authoritarian ones. from the Gulf to Egypt to other areas, we see that there is a mix between liberal ideas and
وكيفية موائمتها مع اقتصاديات العنف أولاً ومع اقتصاديات النخبة المستبدة إن كانت سياسية أو اقتصادية. في طروحات كثير على البدائل الاقتصادية.
There are many ideas about the alternatives. This has been done in the world. There are experiments around the world, but we are not talking about a blue economy, green economy, and the responsibility of the private sector, or an economy without growth. All these are experiments that or other ideas that do not measure up to be alternative economies. The main idea is that this is not a tertiary economy. We are not talking about the civil society that has become like a market economy. We see in Lebanon, Syria, and Palestine that there is no interest in financial sustainability. It has become a trend or a system, and I'm not generalizing, of course, but with the external donations, the sustainability, financial sustainability, brings those groups away from the society. Whereas the work should have been, or the core of the work should have been to stay close to the society. We are talking about a sector that we all forget about, the sector of care, the sector that is based on things that are away from exaggerating a profit and increasing a capital. Part of the civil society is working for their own benefit. It has been spread as if us humans have no other objective but that. What we see in the Arab Spring and in our societies is that people are actually risking their lives for interests that are not personal. So this is a misconception on the economic level as well as on the political level, including the private sector. The majority of the private sector that matches with their population, that is part of the social tissue, that is not only aiming at a profit, but this is one of the fallacies that we should get past. If you could please summarize, says Ms. Samira. Samia. Yes, 3 minutes, please, or even less, if you allow me. Without shifting this power to the society, we will be still talking about the people that are advocating and talking about their wishes or criticizing, which is positive but not useful. What we are talking about is having a social strength that can be switched so that this gives the society a capacity to negotiate and to discuss general policies. Part of us talking about the situation in Syria is to say that a shift of a big number of resources that are already provided from a humanitarian level could become a social power, could be used more in a way, maybe in an unofficial way, if we can call it as such.
الدوافع الموجودة عندنا
and choose the power we have for change and transformation, for social solidarity. We see that there is a rejection of a lot of projects, that there is a lack of solutions that give hope for amelioration in the future, and the decline of the interest in donations that is keeping a big part of the resilience. This is one of the main issues that we have to face. That is a type of normalization with the situation, as Omar has mentioned. In the last minute, I would like to talk about the importance of the areas in Syria and the work and how they are unable of having a system or a model that is meaningful. Already, the Syrian economy is small, and the need for integration is for all regions. The illusion that there could be a successful model, although closed, is not only negative, but it will have a great impact on the economic collapse, and I cannot dwell on this enough. The notes overlapping development strategy are based on social and solidarity economy. The point is to support a better governance within the initiative and to take on projects that are relevant in order to turn the social issues into local issues and to take into consideration justice and solidarity in all the causes we are talking about, linking the producers to the consumers. We are talking about health. We are talking about how to link between sectors and services for the economy to be intertwined with education, with the social aspect, in order to achieve a comprehensive system on the level of the region and on the national level in a way that links all the interests and priorities across regions. Part of the policies that we could talk about are about the food strategies that can be a starting point, but there are also major issues we can work on socially, like removing the tools in the country, limiting the scope of work of warlords that are taking control of the economy, pressuring towards lowering the military expenditure. That is a part of it, but I would like to conclude at the end and say that for the society to have an important role in a social and solidarity economy, it does not have to be in a short period of time, but in situations of conflict, the capacity for change is bigger. And the resistance is lower than the resistance that we usually have. So thank you very much, and sorry if I was too long. Thank you. We do not have a lot of time left. Tariq, feel free to present your paper. We will have 10 minutes left for a discussion. Thank you, Samia. Thank you, Omar. Thank you, Rabia. I think that the order of the interventions is appropriate. We have started from what is general, and I will go more into a specific framework of what we have studied for the solidarity economy in Palestine. I would just like to share my screen with you. The title of the paper has been set later while I was working on the research itself. It focuses on the union resistance in Palestine as a method for resistance and resilience facing colonialism in Palestine. At the beginning, I would like to give a quick introduction about the Palestinian economy and the hegemony that is imposed onto the Palestinian economy. It has been 27 years since the Oslo Agreement was signed, and it increased the affiliation of the Palestinian economy through imposing the conditions on the import on help to Palestine. That was adopted by the Palestinian Authority after Oslo,
ونتج عن
with the support of international organizations, and it has led to difficulties and high rates of unemployment
مع الاقتصاد الإسرائيلي، وبالتالي حصل إخضاع لعملية إخضاع للفلسطينيين
and will to impose onto Palestinians the conditions of the Israelis in getting approvals for a trade or work. Thus, the de facto situation that was imposed led to a regression, to a difficulty in facing the system in Palestine. Thus, our research was about alternative models in the reconstruction and of the Palestinian economy.
So the solidarity economy is one of these models. Some studies tackle the resilience economy or models that are closer to the neoliberal model, like my colleague Rabi' said. He spoke about social production, reducing poverty, social responsibility, but all of these remain models under the neoliberal approach. So there could be some social responsibility in the private sector, but at the same time, this private sector does not give the employees their rights. So this is not an alternative economic system that promotes resilience for Palestinians' resilience. Through reviewing the models of solidarity economy, I saw three phases. We have interconnectedness, bridging, and then linking these groups to the economic resources. So we try to find a Palestinian framework that could lead to a successful solidarity economy, especially that in Palestine we have seen a form of solidarity economy during the first intifada or uprising, but then it failed in later periods, and I will tackle that. When the capital is, of course, the social capital in solidarity economy. And in Palestine, we see it in three axes, and associations and civil society institutions, and unions and cooperatives, and in syndicates. But each of these axes has its own problems. So we have conditioned funding for associations and civil society institutions, and this limits their action, and many of them are only seeking this conditioned funding, and so they're subject to these conditions. There is more than one study that tackled this issue. Now, for the cooperatives and the unions, and through the interviews that we have conducted with them and the research, we have found two main problems. The first one is funding. It has a negative impact, of course, because the funding coming from some donating countries created some fake cooperatives. So this is why some people lost their trust in these cooperatives. The third axis is the syndicates, work syndicates. I focus on that a bit more. But before moving to the third axis, I would like quickly to speak about the Palestinian solidarity economy context that existed during the first Intifada in the 80s. Popular committees were created in the villages and the neighborhoods and the cities during the first Intifada in order to resist to the occupation and provide an alternative economy to that of the colonial economy. At the beginning, this succeeded, but later on it failed because of the absence of bridging between the different committees. These were local committees, but they were not able to bridge between each other, especially that there was no coordination between the different political factions. Most of them were popular committees under political parties. And the absence of coordination between political factions, the committees failed and were dismantled in the beginning of the 90s. And it was the end of one of the popular dimensions of the first Palestinian Intifada or uprising. As I've already mentioned, the Palestinian cooperatives face two main challenges: funding and trust, and also participating in decision making. So there is an issue of transparency here also. It's not always available. Now I go back to the third axis that I wanted to focus on, related to syndicates. The active and efficient syndicates are not discussed here only as a framework that defends the rights of workers. It's also a framework for solidarity between the workers and for their struggle facing the neoliberal policies for an alternative economy. So the syndicates are a main component in the solidarity economy. The success of joint production in cooperatives needs more transparency, more democracy in the production process. And this is maybe absent in some civil society institutions, and it's made absent in some of the cooperatives. But the syndicates that are democratic and transparent, these syndicates can be the framework for this resisting economy or this resilient economy, because then they can really face and confront the neoliberal economy. In Argentina, there was a successful attempt in this regard, although the state and or the government tried to intervene and sabotage this attempt through an alternative or through creating an alternative model of syndicates. And the components that led to the success of this alternative in Argentina is joint properties or joint ownership, democratic governance of cooperatives, and the membership of the there were cooperatives, members of these syndicates, and this is what led to the success of these cooperatives. Now, for the Palestinian syndicates, these syndicates were able to create networks to resist colonialism in some periods, but there was an absence of the role of the formal or official syndicates. So we have independent syndicates in Palestine, but there are syndicates that were founded under the PLO or under political parties that are also part of the PLO. But the syndicates, with time, especially after Oslo Agreement and after the end of the first Intifada uprising, they became only executive frameworks of the PLO, and they followed the Palestinian Authority that uses the neoliberal model. So here there was no democracy, no accountability, no transparency. These syndicates sometimes also did not adopt the viewpoints of their members that wanted to more struggle, that wanted their rights. But there are also independent syndicates that were able to create successful cooperatives, and I mentioned them in the paper. These syndicates supported their workers, and they constituted a successful solidarity economy in the way they supported the resilience of their workers and the places where they worked. As a conclusion, syndicates are a framework for interconnectedness between the members of the syndicate, but also the syndicates have the potential to bridge between themselves, especially when they exist under unions. So there is a possibility to bridge between the different groups or the different syndicates, and they can be a framework for a joint struggle against the neoliberal approach or against colonialism, and to try to have their rights to access the economic resources. Thank you, and I think that now we can move to the questions. Thank you, Sami. Thank you, Tariq. Thank you to all our panelists. Maybe we still have 10 minutes for the questions and answers. I have a number of questions for Rabia and Omar around the Syrian economy in Syria under the current political circumstances. Is there a possibility to dismantle the violence economy and reach a peace economy while there is still no political solution? Is this possible? Allow me to ask a number of questions and then you can try and answer them as much as possible. Now about the role of civil society and the role of the private sector in the solidarity economy. So how can the private sector and civil society play positive roles in activating the solidarity economy? Do you think that the financial aid provided to the displaced Syrians within Syria and outside Syria do not encourage the displaced to come back to their areas? There is also another question about the economic power that could change the economic reality now in Syria. Is it education? Is it the expertise or experiences of the Syrian immigrants? What do you think could be the economic power that can play a great role today in Syria. How can we go beyond the economic sanctions to build a better economic model in Syria? For Tariq, concerning the Palestinian situation, I have a question of my own. Is the solidarity economy something that happens progressively, or is it a reaction to a sudden situation like an intifada, for example? So is it a progressive, so is it a model that's progressively constructed? How do we look at how it's built? Thank you very much. And now the floor is yours, Rabia, Omar, and Tariq, to answer some of these interventions and questions. I would like to thank the colleagues, and I would like to thank you for all the questions that are asked. We can all together think about these questions in both Syria and Palestine, because we need to learn from each other and benefit from each other. I think that Rabia and I can answer the questions related to Syria and to the Syrian refugees. The question related to the political solution. What is a political solution? As I said in my intervention, the Syrian conflict and its manifestations is very complicated. So, and as I said, we shouldn't disregard one dimension or the other. So if you say that the conflict in Syria is only a conflict between states or between elites, and we disregard another national cause that also needs to be addressed, then if we think this way, then political solution is a settlement between these countries. And this doesn't only harness the bad legacy that led to suffocating the society in Syria, but it also harnesses all the distortions that happened in the past 10 or 11 years, which is worse. Even if all the political elite gets what it wants, even if one party, let's say it's the regime or another entity, if the elite gets the power, they will have institutions, but they will have distortions, and they will have conflicts that need to be addressed. Of course, Rabia's intervention went more into these details. So how can we think about transformation? How can you think about the solution in Syria as a shift from this unjust reality to another system where we have fair and just processes? Now, on the horizon, I don't see any political solutions or agreements. This is not even on the table. But when it will be discussed, I think it will be more of political settlements, and it will harness injustice. Maybe there will be some flow of capital. Maybe some people think it will drive a little bit the economy, but it will harness these distortions and the economy as it is. It will increase poverty and inequalities because it will come from the same sources that were there before the conflict. There is a number of questions about the refugees, and here maybe I need to give the floor to Rabia, because based on my experience and my research, we need to support the idea of voluntary return. There is a reason why displaced persons and refugees do not want to come back to Syria, because they don't trust that if they come back, they won't be pursued at the security level, of course. there are still broad issues related to the continuity of the conflict in Syria, in addition to the destruction, of course. The situation of the refugees in different countries, especially in Lebanon and other neighboring countries, we cannot say that their situation at the economic level prevents them from coming back to Syria. The situation in Lebanon is very tough, and the living cost in Lebanon is much higher than the cost of living in Syria. So when people say that, it means that they don't understand the causes of refugee and they don't understand the situation in Lebanon. So this needs more extensive discussion. Maybe Rabia can go more into this. Relying on the development legacy in Syria is important because, yes, development happened in Syria in the past decades, and the institutions were really developed in a certain period in Syria, and we need to rely on that. We shouldn't start counting from 2011 and forget all the advantages and disadvantages before that. Also, when we think about ways to exit this crisis, we think about initiatives and attempts that are made from people that really endured all these years of tyranny and exclusion. Thank you, Omar. Rabia, please. Thank you very much. I read a question about the blue economy in the chat box. The blue economy is about the sustainability of the biological cycle on the coasts and the seas, etc. So it's the economy after the environmental deterioration that we witnessed. Can the private sector be part of the solidarity economy? Yes. The process we're tackling here is the process of building governance. And building governance is very important for the future of the country, for the future of governance in the country and at the international level. Building governance is the basis of transparency and accountability. People do not work with each other nowadays because they lost trust in each other. And because they see there is no transparency or accountability. There are thousands of civil society organizations. The more they're transparent, the closer they are to the society, and the more they can have connections with producers. We don't want it to be like, for example, a project that starts with social support and then ends with the mining. We need to have a space where we meet all together, where this governance starts at the local level and then spread to the other areas. We have the ICTs, we have the civil relationships, we have strong ties that are able to help us create this space, but the space needs to be complementary, and this links me to the next question. What is the main power that can create this change? If we have the necessary human capital and the financial capital, like hundreds of billions today in Syria, we'll have a new conflict because we need to change the way our institutions are built. We need to have an alternative model. We need to think that future is not for exclusion, it's not for disparities. If we don't do that, that we won't be able to be part of a normal society, then even if we have education, even if we have money, this will be in vain. Some educated people were part of hatred in Syria and part of supporting authoritarian and despotic forces. Education doesn't mean that we're working for the public interest. We can use education to hit Hiroshima with a nuclear bomb, or we can use it for good things. Now, we're saying that 25% of the GDP in Syria comes from aid and assistance. If we're not able to control more than 5% of the GDP, if we're able to control, 5% of that, we can have development. And we don't have the costs for the conferences in Geneva and Vienna. People with the resources, this is what we need. If we start with the idea of food sovereignty, I tell you that 99% of people will support these projects across the areas, but this needs organization, this needs work. Until now, civil society, until now, the NGOs are working on dialogue, on policies. Whenever you can open a space in Syria, this is good, but the space should be for connections and ties within Syria and outside Syria. We are saying we can work even under the war. What about the sanctions? Yes, sanctions are affecting Syria, but the sanctions were not an impediment for us creating these spaces. And we can go more into that later on. The despotic forces and what Rami said yesterday about the solidarity economy. In 2019, the social movement started in Lebanon. And it was against corruption, it was against the corrupt institutions. They didn't mention the refugees because they're not the real burden, but this burden can be a part of a development economic model to expand the economy in Lebanon. It's not about how to distribute the aids or the assistance. A Lebanese minister once said that the economic crisis in Lebanon is due to the refugees, but we have different papers about how the situation of the refugees plus the aids that some people say that this is why the Syrians remain in Lebanon. These aids are quite fragmented, and many of these aids were actually lost because of corruption. The idea is that this institutional change needs to happen. If you have a machine that does not help you, then you need to get rid of it. If the institutions in Lebanon are not even helping the Lebanese and of course not helping the refugees, I tell you, this is a crisis of institutions. Thank you. Thank you, Omar and Rabia. For Tarek, there is a question about the failure of solidarity economy in Palestine in the beginning of the 90s, as you said. So the question is, were there any other attempts that happened either at the popular level or the public level? And can we build on the experience of the Palestinian syndicates and mainstream it? This intersects a little bit with the question that you asked when you asked me if this is progressive or if this is like a reaction. In my opinion, building an economic model cannot be a reaction to specific events. It starts from a specific point and then it progressively develops and it's broadened later on. And the Palestinian economy after the failure of the solidarity economy in the first Intifada, there were maybe some simple attempts that succeeded, but these were not sustainable. Maybe they continued for a couple of years and then they ended. This is why the proposal in our study is to start working on that progressively and to start with some syndicates that are already successful, transparent, and independent in their work. So we start with them as a nucleus to be the core of this progressive process that can be broadened later on. Thank you. Thank you, Tarek. Thank you to the panelists, my three colleagues, and I apologize from the audience because there are other questions, but there is no time to ask them, but you can directly contact the panelists and to know more about their presentations. I would like to thank you all for this very interesting panel, and now I would like to give the floor to Helmut. Thank you.
Really, thank you so much, Samia. Absolutely great. And thanks a lot to all the colleagues for this wonderful discussion and the deep insights we could gain, and maybe that could inspire some more innovative ideas on the issue of solidarity economy, cooperatives, the way how to recreate a life in dignity on an economic as well as a social and political level. Thank you really so much. I think it's time for another break for 15 minutes. So it would be great to be back at 5 o'clock Vienna time, 6 o'clock Palestine time, Beirut time, Damascus time. So really, thank you so much. And then we will have our last panel, Researching Back Contradictions and Perspectives at 5 Vienna time, 6 p.m. Beirut and Ramallah time. Thank you.